the destruction and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it was the synagogue and the schools of the Pharisees that survived. Their beliefs became the foundation for what is known today as Rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisees continued to operate and to promote their doctrine in the centuries that followed. It's time to meet the founders of modern-day Judaism. Let's begin with this passage found in Revelation 2:9. Here Yeshua is speaking to John, and he's speaking to him about one of the 7 churches. He says, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Yehudis, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Now, if Scripture is given to us for our instruction, shouldn't we know who these people are? They are pretending to be something that they are not. We are told that there would be a people saying that they are from the house of Judah. Messiah is calling this blasphemy because they are actually from the synagogue of Satan. Note that he didn't associate them with another nationality or ethnicity. He goes to the heart of the matter to tell us who they belong to. He tells us who they are working for. Satan. So who are they and why are they pretending? Let's take a look at another passage from Matthew 23, 1 through 8. Here he's speaking to the multitude and his disciples. He was talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. And he tells them that the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. He also tells the people because of this, whatever the Pharisees told them, they were to observe that and do it, but they were not to imitate the behavior of the Pharisees. Why? He says, for they say and do not. In other words, they were hypocrites. They say, but they did not do what they said. He says, for they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost rooms at feasts, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. And then he told them, don't you be called Rabbi, for there's only one who is your master. And he was basically telling them, that's me, because you are all brethren. Now, often we focus on the Pharisees and completely ignore the scribes. But they had an important role as well. Here Messiah is exposing both of them, because they're sitting in the seat or in the authority of Moses. But they're told, listen to what they say, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. They were binding heavy burdens on the people. They loved to be seen. They sought the highest positions of power, and they wanted to be called Rabbi. Who's called by that title today? But let's dig deeper into this dynamic duo. Let's begin with the scribes, because that role is often overlooked. This is from Christianity.com. It says, who are the scribes in the Bible? So the question is asked, what were the scribes' main duties? The answer is simple. It says copy work. But it was to be done in a certain way, perfectly. The Holy Scriptures or manuscripts were to be protected against corruption, additions, or deletions. The goal was to preserve the Scriptures. So who were the scribes in the Old Testament? It says, being an Old Testament scribe required people who were methodical, observant, intentional, ceremonial, clean, and accurate. So it goes on to say Ezra tops the list, and many commentaries place him as the preeminent scribe in the Bible. He is also a priest, lineage of Aaron, who served during the exile of the Yehudis in Babylon. So from Ezra 7:6, we get this description. It says, this Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses, which the Most High Yah of Israel had given. It goes on to tell us that not only did Ezra know the law of Moses, he also taught the scriptures, and it says most importantly, he obeyed it. Now, based on the rebuke given by Messiah in Matthew 23, the scribes during his day were not obedient to the laws of Moses. They were hypocrites. So there are other sources adding Jeremiah to this list of scribes based on the passage in Jeremiah 36:2 and verses 6, where he's writing on a scroll, and he's also instructing Baruch to write some things on a scroll. And then it says later Jeremiah instructs him to take the scroll, and it says, which you have written at my instruction, and read it in the Most High's house. It says he was called upon to read the word to the people, just as Ezra did. Now it goes on to ask another question. What were the scribes like in Messiah's day? And it says the scribes in the New Testament are often, but not always, Pharisees. They are usually listed together, sometimes only the scribes or a scribe. Their primary duty was to know and preserve the law and lead the people. They were responsible for teaching and interpreting the law. They also handled all legal matters regarding property, estates, and contracts. But it says also, by the time of Messiah, the scribes had added a variety of extra traditions to their teachings. Sadly, their man-made traditions hinder the people from truly knowing Yah, sometimes going against Scripture's idea, as in they knew the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And that's exactly what Satan wants. It's a trick of the enemy, because they caused the laws to become burdensome to men. And Satan wants you to either do too much or too little, because it creates an imbalance. With an imbalance, you won't get the full effect of the intended thing. So in Matthew 15:1-20, Yeshua again rebukes them and say, why do you transgress the commandment of Yah because of your tradition? A corroborating scripture is in Mark 7:13 that says the traditions of men made the word of Yah of non-effect. So we see that there was a lot of corruption with this role. Based on the information covered thus far, we know that it was primarily Idumeans serving in those roles as Pharisees and scribes. And they had already started taking the liberty of changing some things at will, long before the writing of the New Testament. During the time of Yeshua, they only had the Old Testament. But in spite of that, you still had people who were faithful to what is true and what was holy. Why? Because there were some who remembered that they were supposed to meditate on the word day and night to get it down in their heart. And they taught it to their children, just like Scripture said. So let's look at this from Bible Odyssey. It says, even after some of the earliest portions of what later became Scripture were committed to writing, perhaps in the 8th to 7th centuries BCE, orality was still the primary means of transmitting the material that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. In truth, the oral tradition continued to be the dominant means by which most people encountered Scripture throughout the biblical period and beyond. Most people did not read the texts that would become parts of the Bible, but rather heard them. They heard them. Let's keep going. So isn't it interesting that after the fall of Jerusalem, this great devastation, there's widespread destruction. The temple is destroyed. A lot of the Judeans were forced to flee. Some were massacred. Some were taken into captivity. But somehow, the Pharisees managed to escape. Have you ever wondered why? It was because they were not a threat. Let's look at this from Cambridge University Press. It says, in rabbinic tradition, the Pharisaic sages are described as the successors of the men of the great synagogue and ultimately of Moses. Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to men of the great synagogue. They're talking about the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were committed to three things: to be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the law. So the Mishnah commemorates famous sages, and it lists Simeon the Just and others. And it says, committed to writing well after CE 70. The sages enabled the rabbis to make sense of and systematize the development of Jewish religious teaching in the aftermath of the catastrophe. So based on evidence they now have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, they said it's now possible to demonstrate that for much of the Hasmonean period, Pharisaic views were indeed dominant in the Jerusalem temple. In short, the reports of the religious laws attributed to the Pharisees in later Talmudic texts are basically accurate. Moreover, we can now prove that some of the teachings attributed to rabbinic sages who lived after the Roman destruction of the temple actually go back to earlier pre-destruction Pharisaic traditions. So we want to know, where did the teachings come from? How is it that we have the writings of these Pharisees after everything was supposedly destroyed in 70 AD? So let's do some digging. So what exactly is the Talmud? Well, it's the collection of those oral traditions that they call the Mishnah. Added to that, they add the commentary, which they call the Gemara. So they are guided by the Babylonian Talmud. That's supposed to be the most authoritative version of the Talmud. Here's the problem. As I go through this, you'll see that it has created a lot of confusion because they're using terms interchangeably. For example, the Israelites were given laws, statutes, and commandments to guide their everyday life. They were not given a religion. It was a way of life. Judaism, however, as practiced today, is a religion. But it's assumed that it is exactly the same as the instructions that were given to our forefathers. So after our people were scattered after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Pharisees, most of whom were Edomites, basically blended everything together. What they say they follow is the Tanakh, plus their oral traditions and commentary. The other part of the confusion is that people call them Jews or Jewish and tie them to this religion called Judaism. But how could all of the tribes of Israel be called by one of the tribes, Judah? It does not make sense, does it? So understand that as I'm going to be reading through this, they're tying all of this together, and they're calling the ancient Israelites, those who fled, those who left the land after the destruction, they're calling them Jews. And they're calling their way of life Judaism. But it was not. So make sure you understand that. So let's spend some time looking at information from this journal article from Vanderbilt EDU, and it's entitled Rabbinic and Other Judaisms, and this is the period from 70 AD to 250 AD. It says the War of 66 to 70 was as much a turning point for Judaism as it was for Christianity. In the aftermath of the war and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, Judeans went in several religious directions. In the long run, the most significant by far was the movement toward Rabbinic Judaism, on which the source material is vast but narrow and of dubious reliability. So it says their information that they have immediately following the destruction is scanty, but it says they have to rely on information that comes from archaeology because textual traditions are almost totally lacking. It says this is especially regrettable when you recognize that two non-rabbinic traditions of Judaism were very widespread at the time. Through at least the 4th century, the Hellenistic diaspora and the non-rabbinic Aramaic diaspora each seem to have included several million Judeans. It says the Pharisees not only survived the War of 66 to 70, but prospered in its aftermath. From the oldest of the Pharisaic schools came the institutions essential for Rabbinic Judaism. Now ask yourself, how could that be possible? The Romans are slaughtering or capturing Israelites and enslaving them, but the Pharisees not only survived, they thrived. So it says the Pharisees constituted a religious elite, and although they were resented or criticized by some, they're speaking about Messiah who called them whitewashed sepulchres, it says most of the Amharites held them in great respect, and that means the people of the land. The Pharisees also had at least the beginnings of a corporate character, with little schools in Jerusalem for the study of the oral Torah. So they began setting up these schools. It says established during the reign of the Herods the Great by the famous teachers Hillel and Shammai. The schools, the Beth Hillel and Beth Shammai, remained vigorous long after their founder's death and right up to the rebellion of 66 through 70. A man who had learned the oral Torah and then taught it was a Tana or teacher. It says, but by his students he was also called Rabbi, which meant my Lord or my Master, and connoted both affection and respect. Now it talks about this Beth Shammai, or this school, being outspoken against the Romans, and it came to an end during the siege, but according to Josephus, one of the most respected members of the school survived, and he served as the bridge from the Pharisees of Jerusalem to the rabbinic schools of the post-temple period. This man, Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was an elderly Pharisee and a Tana or teacher. But how did he manage to escape? It was because he was against the armed rebellion, and he told his students not to participate. So it goes on to say, although not necessarily more pro-Roman than other Pharisees, Yochanan was opposed to the armed rebellion and counseled his students not to join it, according to an unlikely rabbinic legend. When Vespasian was besieging Jerusalem, Yochanan's nephew devised an escape for his uncle. The rabbi pretended to be dead, was carried out of Jerusalem on a bier, and was brought to Vespasian. However it was done, this rabbi secured either Vespasian's or Titus's permission to establish a Pharisaic center in Jamnia. And this was a small Palestinian city, and it was about an hour's walk from the sea, 10 miles north of Ashdod, and it served as an asylum for Judeans for the peace party. It says it was not much affected by the revolt, and so was a suitable place for the Pharisees' project. How interesting that the other Yehudis were running, being chased into Africa, but they managed to overlook the city. And as they call it, this was a suitable place for the project that these Pharisees were working on. I wonder what that project was. It says, whether it was Vespasian or Titus who approved the establishment of a Pharisaic school in Jamnia, it is clear that the Romans found it wise to allow this institution to have the same authority that rested with the high priest and the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem before the destruction. So this Nasi, or prince of the Pharisees at Jamnia, was treated by the Romans as in some ways a replacement for the high priest in Jerusalem. I hope you heard that. So it says, the Nasi after 70 or 70 AD were ratified by the Roman authorities, who could thus ensure that Jewish leadership remained in the hands of politically acceptable men. Now take a guess. Are they talking about an Israelite or an Idumean? I think you know the answer. So it's safe to say Jewish here. So it says the Nasi took over from the high priest the responsibility for, listen, fixing the religious calendar. Passover, weeks, and tabernacles were no longer great pilgrim festivals, while some Judeans continued to celebrate them in Jerusalem even without a temple and a high priest. Most inhabitants of Judea began to follow the example of diaspora Judeans and celebrated the festivals in their local synagogues. Thus was one of the inducements to revolt, the gathering of massive crowds in Jerusalem, removed from the concerns of the Roman governors. So it says, with the end of the high priests and of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, the Pharisees at Jamnia set up a council or court of their own, again with Roman approval. This court, the Beth Din, was intended to play the role of the old Sanhedrin as the highest court in administering traditional Judean law, and the presiding officer was the Nasi. Because the Beth Din consisted entirely of Pharisees, its administration of justice rested as much on the oral as on the written Torah, since both had been given by Adonai. For some time after its establishment, the Beth Din did not enjoy the same respect in which the old Jerusalem Sanhedrin had been held. It was, however, the highest court in which Judeans could be judged according to Judean law, and so it gradually won the acceptance throughout Judea. So again, these points are being made so that you can see when a lot of the changes began. It says, by the end of the 1st century CE, the Judean literary tradition, which had begun almost 400 years earlier, included several hundred books. Many of these, for example, the 30 books written by Josephus, were never intended to be read in the synagogues, and evidently never were. On the other hand, the synagogues at the time did make use of a fair number of books that few people today would regard as sacred. The various sects had various ideas about what books were or were not appropriate in worship. The Qumran scrolls reveal a relatively wide latitude, while the Sadducees seem to have regarded only the Pentateuch as sacred. As the Pharisees saw it, the Sadducean list was far too narrow, while other sects were not discriminating enough. The Pharisaic list included what they called 24 books, all in Hebrew. And at Jamnia, these 24 were canonized as the books that defile the hands. So these were the books in which the name of the Most High appeared and was said to be too sacred to be vocalized, what they call the Tetragrammaton. So it says an Aramaic Targum or a Greek translation, neither of which included the Tetragrammaton, was not so sacred as the Hebrew original. The 24 sacred books included the 5 books of Moses, which were Torah par excellence, 8 books of the prophets, which they called Nebiim, and 11 of a somewhat less prestigious category called the writings, or Ketubim. From these 3 divisions, Torah, Nebiim, Ketubim, evolved the acronym Tanakh. The Pharisees and their successors at Jamnia thus defined, listen, what today is called the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, but which here will usually be called the Tanakh. So when we talk about folks putting their hands on our books, let's not forget that the Pharisees had that opportunity as well. It says the Tanakh omitted many books that were great favorites in the 1st century. The romances of Judith and Tobit did not defile the hands, nor did the Maccabee literature, which by the 1st century CE had proliferated to 4 books. The Jamnia scholars were intent upon, listen, dampening messianism, and were happy to cull or cut from the holy category almost all of the apocalyptic books. Daniel was the exception, but was demoted from the prophets category to the writings. For good measure, Gamaliel II, as we have seen, added to the Shemoneh Esrei prayer the 12th benediction, which was not a benediction at all, but a curse upon the Nazarene and other heretics. So the rabbis, it says, regarded as secular and so of little value not only the new pseudepigraphia such as 2nd and 3rd Baruch and the War Scroll, but also such venerable texts as Jubilees and the Book of the Watchers. What books met the standards of the Pharisees and the teachers at Jamnia did not immediately interest the synagogues, especially those of the Greek-speaking diaspora. So it was really these Pharisees that determined which books would be considered Old Testament books. And it says, as the Greek-speaking diaspora dwindled in the late 4th and 5th centuries, the rabbinical Tanakh became synonymous with the Bible of the Hebrews. When Jerome produced his Versio Vulgata, a fine Latin translation of the Bible, his Old Testament mirrored the selection made by the rabbis. The books that had been part of the Septuagint, but which had been rejected at Jamnia, were grouped by Jerome in a separate category, the Apocrypha, which belonged neither to the Old nor to the New Testament. It says the apocryphal books continued to be read in all Christian churches in the Middle Ages. So listen, the selection of sacred books made by the Pharisees and the Tanaim, or the teachers at Jamnia, reflected their preoccupation with the Torah, both written and oral. The resulting Hebrew Bible was perhaps less appealing to worshippers than was the Septuagint, but that does not seem to have been of much concern to the teachers. They believed, first of all, that the oral Torah was as important as the written text. They also knew, after the destruction of the temple and the end of sacrifice at Jerusalem, that long stretches of the Tanakh were no longer meaningful on the literal level, and they believed that to understand the true meaning of these texts, long years of study were required. It says, although the rabbis at Jamnia discouraged messianism, apocalyptic predictions and messianic hopes long survived the War of 66 to 70. The fanaticism was dulled, however, and many Judeans resigned themselves to the likelihood that the Messianic age was far in the future. As it goes on, it says in the early 2nd century, another long-term Judean tradition came to an end, which was the composition or the writings of the Greek apologists of Judaism. And they were trying to defend their opinions, positions, or their actions. So it says the texts written by Judean apologists had been addressed to Hellenes and were intended to convince them that Judaism was ancient, correct, and noble. This says the last, and in some ways the best equipped of the Judean apologists was Josephus. He was born by the name Joseph ben Matthiah, was born in 37 CE, the son of a priest. It says he was familiar with the schools, or the three schools of Judaism, and he found the Pharisees to be most persuasive. So some sources point to him as a Pharisee, and there are other names for him as well. But I'm going to speak more about him in another session. But during the fall of Jerusalem, he was appointed as the Judeans' commander in Galilee. But early in the war, he was captured by the Romans and afterwards was assigned minor duties by Vespasian and Titus. When he arrived in Rome in AD 71, he was given Roman citizenship by Vespasian. And as a client of the Flavian family, his name was changed to Titus Flavius Josephus. But again, we'll talk more about him later. So those among our people who managed to escape, they continued to fight in various places where they had been scattered. This says, we do not know to what extent messianic hopes and prophecies played a role in the violence by diaspora Judeans that devastated several lands of the eastern Mediterranean along or during the reign of Trajan, talking about AD 98 through 117. It says more likely is that diaspora Judeans turned to violence in a desperate attempt to create a more ordinary kind of state, whether monarchical or republican. Whatever was the cause of the tumults, these wars took the lives of close to 1 million people, the casualties being almost equal among Gentiles and Judeans. By the time the violence ended in late AD 117, listen, Judaism was virtually extinguished in 2 of the Roman Empire's eastern provinces and drastically reduced in a third. This was not, however, a general revolt of the diaspora. The massacres were almost entirely confined to those few areas in which Judeans were numerous enough to challenge their Gentile rulers. So cities such as Corinth, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Rome itself, where Judeans were a relatively small minority in an otherwise Gentile population, were apparently not affected. So how did they put an end to all of the revolts? Well, the Pharisees used words. They dispelled the messianic dreams that had fueled the violence in the rebels, and instead told them they needed to devote themselves to holiness. And where did they learn how to be holy? Well, in the schools the Pharisees had set up, of course. What did they say to the Romans? They reminded them how divine vengeance had struck down Titus for burning the temple. So the lesson to the Romans was that the Judeans didn't have to attack the Roman Empire because the Most High would strike down those who wronged his people. As it goes on, it says it's evident that in the late 1st or the 2nd century, Judaism first appeared in North Africa, the land that is today northern Libya, Tunisia, northern Algeria, and Morocco. And until the early 1950s, it's saying Judaism remained important in North Africa, even though from the 7th century onward, the land had been under Muslim control. So why was that? So it's because it says Ethiopic Judaism reflects a pre-Talmudic stage of the religion. It was there before the Talmud got there. So it says the Hebrew language was not used in prayer and worship, and the oral law was evidently never a part of the Falashas' religious tradition. Their sacred canon includes the books of Enoch and Jubilees, both of which were popular in Hellenistic Judaism, but were rejected by the rabbinic academies along with other apocryphal religious texts. So listen, these peculiarities indicate that the roots of Judaism in Ethiopia go back further than the 5th and 6th centuries when the Talmuds became normative. So it's talking about how the Christians in Ethiopia practiced circumcision when Christians elsewhere were instructed not to do so. They were able to distinguish between clean and unclean foods. They were following the laws regarding marriage. And it says they proudly call themselves children of Israel. They call themselves children of Israel. So this researcher, Oldendorf, concluded before the middle of the 4th century, when Christianity became the kingdom's established religion, Judaism must have been widespread in Ethiopia. He supposed that it came to Ethiopia from Saba across the Strait of Bab al-Mandab. But we already know they were already there. This is just proving that they were already in Africa. And if they were already there, more than likely they had the scrolls. So it says, for as far back as they can be traced, the Falashas have used a Tanakh written in Ge'ez. This version was apparently translated not from the Hebrew originals, but from the Greek Septuagint. When this was done, and by whom is uncertain, but most specialists believe that it was begun by Christians not long after King Azana's conversion. It may not have been completed until the 5th or even the 6th century. It says, if translation into Ge'ez did not begin until after Azana's conversion to Christianity, Judeans in Ethiopia during the Ptolemaic and early Roman imperial periods must have used the Septuagint, and in Sabbath worship orally translated the passage into Ge'ez. At least some ancient Ethiopians knew Greek as a second language. So it says 6 Greek inscriptions from the Aksumite kingdom have been found. Although Christians may well have translated all of their Old Testament as well as their New Testament from Greek into Ge'ez, it is not impossible that after the creation of a Ge'ez alphabet, parts of the Septuagint were put into Ge'ez by Judaized Ethiopians. Let's go on, family. So credible sources say that the Ethiopian Bible is the oldest and most complete Bible on earth, much older than the King James Version, and it contains 81 to 88 books compared to the 66. I wonder if that was a coincidence. The 66 books in the King James. Let's go on. Here you can see one of the pages from the Ethiopian Bible, and you can clearly see by the pictures that the Israelites were dark melanated people. So it says experts believe that in this book, this Ethiopian Bible, it has the earliest example of book binding still attached to the original pages. It says the survival of the Gospels is incredible, considering the country has been under Muslim invasion, Italian invasion, and a fire in the 1930s destroyed the monastery's church. They were written on goat skin in the early Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. There are 2 volumes which date from the same time, but the second is written in a different hand from the first. Both contain illustrations and the 4 Gospels. So here's the thing. They have a Bible that predates the King James Version by nearly 800 years. But it only has 4 of the Gospels of the New Testament. So we need to continue digging to find out why. But what we do know is that folks had their hands on our books and they were trying to manipulate the words long before the Roman Catholic Church got them, because they know the power of Yah's words. And here's the thing. Even after trying to burn the books, hide the books, they tried to stop us from reading the books. Here we are seeing the prophecies unfolding. They thought they could stop the plans of the Most High, but in the end, we see that what He said is happening right before our eyes. Don't you think the Most High knew what they were going to do before they did it? Here we see in Matthew 16:5-12, Messiah is speaking to the disciples and He's telling them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had no idea what He was talking about. They thought He was upset because they had not brought enough bread. So in verse 11 He says, "How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Then they understood that He did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine, the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So yes, even back then, when Messiah walked the earth, they were adding leaven to try to deceive us. The ultimate plan of Yah is going to be fulfilled regardless of what they do. Regardless, they can't stop it. So we will continue with this. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please remember to hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Join me next time.